Imagine walking into a room and finding 19 coffins, small coffins, children's coffins, and standing over them, completely calm, is their own brother, counting to make sure he didn't miss anyone. This actually happened, January 28th, 1595, the Ottoman palace in Constantinople. And the man doing the counting had just become the most powerful ruler in the world. He'd ordered the execution of every single one of his brothers. The youngest was just 11 months old. But here's the truly insane part. This wasn't considered evil or cruel. It was the law. In fact, if he hadn't done it, he would have been seen as weak. And weakness in the Ottoman Empire meant death. This is Sultan Mehmed III. He's one of the most ruthless rulers in history. And boy, did he enjoy the absolute power that came with eliminating every possible threat to his throne. At just 29 years old, he controlled an empire spanning 3 continents, commanded over 100,000 soldiers, and possessed wealth that would be worth billions today. But Mehmed didn't stop at killing his 19 brothers. Over the next 8 years of his reign, he would execute his own son, order the deaths of countless family members, and create such a culture of paranoia and fear that mothers would poison their own children rather than see them strangle each other for power. The Ottoman Empire, at its peak, controlled 2 million square miles of territory. That's larger than the entire Roman Empire at its height. And at the center of it all sat Mehmed III, a man so paranoid about losing power that he turned the palace into a slaughterhouse. But how does a prince raised in luxury and education end up standing over the corpses of 19 siblings without shedding a single tear? How does someone go from writing poetry and studying Islamic law to becoming one of history's most notorious fratricides? Little did anyone know that Mehmed's story would become the perfect example of how absolute power doesn't just corrupt, it demands blood sacrifice. And the most shocking part? The system that created Mehmed III wasn't an accident. It was carefully designed over centuries to produce exactly this kind of ruler. You see, the Ottomans had discovered something terrifying about human nature and power that most of us don't want to admit is true. They realized that when it comes to holding on to absolute power, family means nothing. Love means nothing. Even basic human decency becomes a liability. And Mehmed III would prove this theory in the most brutal way imaginable. Welcome to the insane true story of Sultan Mehmed III. Early life and character building. Mehmed was born on May 26th, 1566, in the magnificent Manisa Palace in western Turkey. His father was the future Sultan Murad III, and his mother was Safiye Sultan, an Albanian woman who had been captured as a slave before rising to become one of the most powerful women in the empire. From the moment he was born, Mehmed's life was shaped by one inescapable fact: he had brothers, lots of them. And in the Ottoman Empire, that meant he was born into a death match that would only end when one of them sat on the throne and the rest lay in their graves. You see, the Ottomans had a law called fratricide, literally meaning brother killing. It stated that whoever became sultan had the legal right, even the obligation, to execute all his brothers to prevent civil war. The law had been established by Mehmed the Conqueror over a century earlier with chilling logic. It is appropriate that whichever of my sons the sultanate should pass to, he should kill his brothers for the order of the world. Mehmed would later reflect on this and say it was the first lesson that shaped his entire worldview. In the Game of Thrones, you either win or you die. There is no middle ground. As a young prince, Mehmed was sent to govern the province of Manisa at age 12, a traditional training ground for future sultans. Here's where his character truly began to form. While his tutors taught him Arabic, Persian, mathematics, and military strategy, his mother Safiye was teaching him something far more valuable: how to survive in a world where your own blood wanted you dead. She would whisper to him constantly about his brother's movements, their alliances, their weaknesses. It was an early lesson for Mehmed that information was more powerful than any sword. Every night she would remind him, "They're not your brothers, they're your competition, and only one of you will live to see 40. The truth is, Mehmed wasn't naturally cruel. Reports from his early years as governor describe him as scholarly, even gentle. He wrote poetry, studied Islamic philosophy, and was known for his beautiful calligraphy. But there was an incident when he was 15 that changed everything. One of his younger brothers, Prince Mahmud, was invited to visit him in Manisa. The two boys spent 3 days together, hunting, reading, genuinely enjoying each other's company. On the final night, Mahmud tried to poison Mehmed's wine. The plot was discovered by Safiye's spies just in time. Mehmed never forgot that betrayal. From that moment, he understood that in his world, showing affection was showing weakness. Trust was suicide. Love was a luxury he couldn't afford. His mother noticed the change immediately. Where once there had been a sensitive boy who wrote verses about nature and beauty, now stood a young man who studied his brothers like a general studying enemy positions. He began keeping detailed notes on each of them, their supporters, their weaknesses, their daily routines. You see, Mehmed realized something crucial that night. His brother tried to kill him. The throne wouldn't go to the strongest or the smartest or even the most ruthless. It would go to the one who struck first. And when his father, Sultan Murad III, died on January 15th, 1595, Mehmed was ready. He had spent years preparing for this moment, building a network of supporters, especially among the Janissaries, the elite military corps that served as kingmakers in the Ottoman Empire. He knew that he who controlled the army controlled the empire. The rise to power. The moment news reached Mehmed that his father was dying, he did something that revealed just how strategically his mind worked. Instead of rushing to Constantinople to claim the throne, he waited. He sent his most trusted agents ahead to secure the loyalty of key military commanders with massive bribes. We're talking the equivalent of millions in today's money. But Mehmed saw an opportunity here that his brothers missed. While they scrambled to gather their forces and race to the capital, Mehmed was already 3 moves ahead. Using these new connections, he had his agents spread rumors that he was sick, possibly dying, too weak to claim the throne. His brothers relaxed, thinking they had more time to prepare. Then, in a masterpiece of deception, Mehmed had his mother Safiye conceal his father's death for 3 days. During those 3 days, she issued orders in the dying sultan's name, ordering all of Mehmed's brothers to come to the palace for an urgent family meeting. They came willingly, thinking their father was still alive. It was such an incredibly simple move, but it was the meticulous planning that made it possible. By the time his brothers realized the trap, Mehmed's forces had already surrounded the palace. In many ways, the battle for succession was over before it even began. But here's the crucial part. Mehmed understood that taking the throne wasn't enough. He needed to hold it. And in the Ottoman system, there was only one way to guarantee that. On January 28th, 1595, just hours after being proclaimed sultan, Mehmed issued the order that would define his reign. All 19 of his brothers were to be executed immediately. What people didn't realize was that Mehmed had spent months preparing for this moment. He had personally selected the executioners, deaf mutes from the palace, who couldn't be bribed with words or pleas for mercy. He had prepared the silk bowstrings that would be used. Tradition demanded that royal blood not be spilled. He had even arranged for religious authorities to be present, to provide legal blessing for the executions. The killings began at dawn. The youngest princes were brought out first. The executioners would enter their rooms while they slept, loop the silk cord around their necks, and pull. It took less than a minute. The older princes, those who understood what was happening, tried to fight or hide. Prince Mustafa, just 13 years old, barricaded himself in his room and had to be dragged out screaming. Prince Ibrahim tried to bribe the guards with his mother's jewels. None of it mattered. One by one, 19 brothers were strangled. Their bodies were laid out in rows in the palace courtyard for Mehmed to inspect. He walked among them slowly, checking each face, making sure none had escaped. Witnesses say he showed no emotion. When he was satisfied, he simply nodded and walked away. The master scheme, divided by peak power, but here's what's absolutely insane. Mehmed didn't stop there. You see, the surface-level story is that he killed his brothers to secure the throne. What historians didn't realize until recently was that this was just the beginning of a much larger and more systematic purge. Mehmed now had absolute power, and this is very different from what normal people understand as power. When you're the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire in 1595, you control the lives of 30 million people. Your word is literally law. If you say someone dies, they die. If you say a city burns, it burns. And Mehmed was about to use this power in ways that even hardened Ottoman officials found shocking. Within his first year, Mehmed executed over 40 members of the extended royal family, cousins, uncles, anyone with even a distant claim to the throne. But here's the crucial part that makes this even more calculated. He didn't do it all at once. Instead, he would invite family members to the palace for honors and celebrations, treat them like valued relatives for weeks or months, and then suddenly have them strangled in their sleep. The psychological torture was deliberate. Everyone in the palace lived in constant fear, never knowing if today's feast would be tomorrow's funeral. What people didn't realize was that Mehmed was using terror as a tool of governance. By keeping everyone afraid, he ensured absolute obedience. The peak of Mehmed's power came in 1596, when he decided to lead the Ottoman army personally against the Habsburgs in Hungary. This was meant to be his moment of glory, proof that he wasn't just a fratricidal monster, but a warrior sultan like his ancestors. The campaign started with incredible pomp: 100,000 soldiers, 300 cannons, supply trains stretching for miles. Mehmed rode at the center in golden armor, surrounded by 10,000 Janissary guards. The army was so massive that it took 3 full days just to cross the Danube River. At the Battle of Orestes, Mehmed's forces initially seemed unstoppable. They overran the Christian positions, captured dozens of enemy standards, and were on the verge of total victory. But then something happened that revealed the fatal flaw in Mehmed's character. As his troops pursued the fleeing enemy, they stumbled upon the Habsburg supply trains, wagons full of gold, silver, and precious goods. The soldiers stopped fighting and started looting. Mehmed, from his position on a hill overlooking the battlefield, could see his army falling apart, but he was too paranoid to ride down and rally them personally. You see, Mehmed had killed so many people to get power that he lived in constant fear of assassination. He wore armor even while sleeping. He had food tasters check every meal 3 times. He trusted no one, not even his own generals. So while his army dissolved into chaos, Mehmed sat frozen on his hill, watching a certain victory turn into near disaster. Only the heroism of his individual commanders saved the day, turning the battle into a narrow Ottoman victory. The consequences and complications. The problem was, Mehmed had created a system built entirely on fear, and fear alone cannot sustain an empire. After the Hungarian campaign, things began to unravel rapidly. The Sultan, who had killed 19 brothers to avoid civil war, ended up creating exactly the chaos he'd tried to prevent. You see, with no brothers left as potential heirs, the question of succession fell to Mehmed's sons. And having learned from their father's example, they began plotting against each other while Mehmed was still alive. But the paranoia didn't stop there. Mehmed became convinced that his eldest son, Prince Mahmud, was planning to overthrow him. In 1603, Mehmed ordered his own son's execution. The prince was just 20 years old. But here's where it gets even darker. Mahmud's mother, one of Mehmed's concubines, begged for her son's life. She threw herself at Mehmed's feet, sobbing, reminding him of the nights they'd spent together, the love they'd shared. Mehmed's response? He had her strangled too. Then he executed 4 of Mahmud's closest friends, then their families. The death toll from this single act of paranoia reached over 30 people. Little did Mehmed know that by killing his most capable son, he had just signed the death warrant for the Ottoman Empire's golden age. The empire that had once been the terror of Europe began to rot from within. Mehmed spent his final years locked in the palace, seeing conspiracies everywhere. He executed grand viziers, essentially prime ministers, at a rate of almost one per year. Government officials were so terrified of making decisions that might displease him that the administration ground to a halt. The economy began to collapse. Rebellions broke out in the provinces. The Janissaries, the very troops who had put him on the throne, began to openly mock him, calling him Mehmed the Paranoid behind closed doors. However, back in Constantinople, people were starting to ask questions about whether a sultan who killed his own son was fit to rule. The religious authorities who had once blessed his fratricides were now whispering about divine punishment. The downfall. Then, in December 1603, Mehmed's body began to betray him, just as he had betrayed everyone around him. He developed a severe intestinal condition that caused him excruciating pain. Some historians believe he was slowly poisoned, poetic justice for a man who lived in fear of poison. Others think it was simply the stress of 8 years of paranoia finally breaking his body. For days, Mehmed lay in his bed, screaming in agony, unable to eat, unable to sleep. The man who had shown no mercy to his infant brothers now begged for death. As news of the Sultan's illness spread, the palace descended into chaos. Officials who had lived in terror of Mehmed for years suddenly began making their own plans. His mother, Safiye, the woman who had taught him that family meant nothing compared to power, was already negotiating with potential successors. His surviving sons circled like vultures, each calculating their chances of survival. The empire Mehmed had killed so many to control was slipping through his fingers like sand. On December 20th, 1603, Sultan Mehmed III finally died. He was just 37 years old. For Mehmed, as the consequences of his fratricidal reign started to come out, there was no peace even in death. His funeral was a paranoid affair. Officials were so scared of assassination attempts that the ceremony was rushed, private, almost secretive. The man who had demanded absolute obedience was buried with barely any of the traditional honors given to a sultan. As for Mehmed's legacy, he left behind an empire in crisis. His surviving son, Ahmed I, broke with Ottoman tradition and didn't execute his brother when he took the throne. The trauma of Mehmed's reign had been so severe that even the Ottomans realized their system had gone too far. The practice of royal fratricide, which had defined the empire for centuries, effectively ended with Mehmed III. In a strange way, his excessive cruelty saved future generations of Ottoman princes from suffering the same fate. Aftermath and legacy. Ultimately, though, the people who suffered most were not the princes who died. Their deaths, at least, were quick. The real victims were the millions of Ottoman subjects who lived under a government paralyzed by fear. The empire that had once conquered Constantinople and stood at the gates of Vienna began its long, slow decline into what historians would later call the sick man of Europe. What is clear is this entire story was an example of how absolute power, when combined with systematic fratricide, can destroy not just individuals but entire civilizations. The Ottoman Empire never fully recovered from the damage Mehmed III inflicted in his 8-year reign of terror. Reports suggest that towards the end, Mehmed had gone from a scholarly young prince who wrote poetry to a monster who couldn't sleep without checking under his bed for assassins. He had become the very thing he feared most: alone, surrounded by enemies, waiting for death. The boy who had once written verses about the beauty of spring flowers died convinced that everyone wanted to kill him. And the tragic irony? He was probably right. By killing everyone who might have loved him, Mehmed had ensured that only those who feared or hated him remained. Modern psychologists studying Mehmed's case point to it as a textbook example of how power and paranoia create a destructive cycle. The more power you seize through violence, the more violence you need to maintain it. The more people you kill, the more people want to kill you. It's a cycle that has repeated throughout history, from ancient Rome to Nazi Germany to modern dictatorships. Mehmed III just took it to its logical, horrifying conclusion. What makes his story particularly relevant today is how it shows that systems designed to prevent conflict, like the Ottoman law of fratricide, can actually create even worse outcomes. The Ottomans thought that by legalizing brother killing, they were preventing civil wars. Instead, they created generations of traumatized, paranoid rulers who destroyed their empire from within. Sometimes the cure really is worse than the disease. Outro and next video setup. Now, whilst the story of Mehmed III is pretty horrifying, I still wouldn't call him the most psychologically twisted ruler in history. For that, you're going to want to check out the absolutely insane story of Emperor Caligula, a man who made his horse a senator, declared war on the sea, and built a floating bridge across the Bay of Naples just so he could ride his horse across it wearing Alexander the Great's breastplate. But that's not even the craziest part. What Caligula did to his own sisters makes Mehmed's fratricide look almost rational by comparison. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.